Hi, I'm Chad with CLE Feed. Thank you for joining our course today entitled Criminal Defense Investigations, Hiring a Private Investigator. And one of our presenters today is attorney Stevie Phillips. Stevie is attorney in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where she practices criminal defense. Stevie, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me today, Chad. Yes, I do currently practice in Chattanooga. My main area of practice is criminal defense work. I work in federal and state court. I handle everything from run-of-the-mill DUIs to the death penalty. I graduated from UT Law in 2008, so I have been practicing for just over a decade now. I then spent about 3 years clerking for judges in chambers. I first clerked for 2 years with Janice Holder on the Tennessee Supreme Court during the time that she was our first female Chief Justice. And then I clerked in federal district court with Judge Bernice Donald, who is now on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. After that, I moved back to Chattanooga, where I worked for a small boutique trial firm that focused on criminal defense work for about 5 years. I worked briefly as a federal prosecutor in California and then came back to Chattanooga in 2017 and started my own firm, Stevie Phillips Law.
Okay. And where are you currently barred?
I'm barred in Tennessee and California.
Okay. Well, I wanted to take a minute, too, before we get too deep into the CLE, and just thank you for being here. Very qualified to give the CLE, but also want to thank you just for the inspiration that you've been to me in my legal career. I always lean on you for advice, and for years. And truthfully, your passion for the law is one of the main reasons I chose to pursue a legal career. So I want to thank you sincerely for me personally, and also CLE Feed for presenting today. So we have a lot to look forward for you. The viewers, I think, will be well educated after today. What can we expect from the presentation today?
So first of all, I'm going to talk to our viewers a little bit about the types of issues that come up in my practice that may warrant hiring a private investigator. And then I'm very excited to say that we're going to be joined by Kay Baker of Phoenix Investigative Services. And Kay is going to talk with us about how to locate a private investigator, how to determine whether that PI is qualified, and how to determine whether that PI is well suited for your particular case.
Okay. Yeah, I look forward to hearing from Kay. Next question would be, what attorneys would most benefit from watching this CLE today? So who's the target audience?
That's a good question. I would recommend that criminal defense attorneys practicing in state and federal court who may not have hired a private investigator watch this particular CLE.
Okay. Thank you, Stevie, for the introduction. As we move through the course today, if the viewers have follow-up questions or inquiries, where can they contact you?
So please don't hesitate to contact me directly. You can call me at 423-645-7734 or shoot me an email at stevie@steviephillipslaw.com.
Great, and we'll post a link to that in the electronic materials and possibly in the link to the video. Well, let's get started. First question today is, why should an attorney considering it choose to hire a private investigator?
Sure. So in my experience, a private investigator can be an invaluable member of any skilled criminal defense team. You have to remember that the prosecutor is working very hard with all of his or her resources, which includes multiple law enforcement agencies, to build a case of incriminating evidence against any particular defendant. And we have to work just as hard and employ multiple strategies to uncover exculpatory and mitigating evidence.
So what type of things that you as an attorney may need done beyond what you just mentioned that a private investigator can help with?
Well, if you've never retained a PI, I think you'll be surprised at how much one can do to enhance your client's defense. I've broken down the types of things that I often retain PIs to do for me into 7 categories.
Okay.
Those categories are reviewing discovery, retrieving documents, locating and interviewing witnesses, assessing witness credibility, examining the scene, technology and special skills, and jury trial preparation.
Great. Well, the first category you mentioned was reviewing discovery. Can you be more specific and go into some detail about what that actually means?
The first thing that I do when I hire a PI is sit down with that person and make sure that they understand what my client has been charged with and that they're familiar with the applicable statutes. The next thing I'll do is hand over the discovery, the body of evidence that the prosecutor has supplied me for that PI to review. That's typically going to include police reports, witness statements, a variety of different types of documentary evidence. And my goal in having the PI review those documents, even though I've already reviewed them, is for that person to determine whether there are holes or gaps in the prosecutor's evidence, whether there are inconsistencies in those witness statements, and whether there's any additional documentation that might be helpful to give us a more clear picture of the prosecution's position in the case, and also to help us identify what our client's defenses might be.
Okay, and just another follow-up question is, you're speaking discovery, so once this case has been moving and potentially being litigated already, is that when you choose to hire a private investigator, or do sometimes you work with one much earlier on in a case?
That's a good question. So it's not uncommon for me to be retained pre-indictment or pre-charge. So I may get a call from a client who has been notified that they're being investigated by state or federal law enforcement agencies. At that time, it would be extremely important that we hired a PI to build our case essentially at the same time that the state or the federal government is building their case. More often than not, we're going to be retained post-charge, post-indictment, at which time the government has the burden of supplying the discovery to us, and we're really reviewing what they've given us and then identifying where further investigation may be necessary.
Okay. Stevie, the second area you mentioned was retrieving documents. What type of documents would you typically rely on a private investigator to locate?
So the first category of documents we've got to locate are those that are absent from the discovery, the documents that may fill in the holes and gaps in that discovery and give us a more clear picture of the case. That can be a variety of different documents. Second, I will usually have a PI gather all of my clients' prior criminal history documents. So in state and federal court, a defendant's exposure depends in large part on his or her criminal background. So we'll want to determine what the client has been charged with in the past and retrieve all the judgments associated with those cases. And then, of course, we need mitigating evidence. That's going to be documentary evidence that I can use during the course of plea negotiations with the prosecutor, as well as at sentencing if necessary. Mitigating documentation might be jail records, medical records, employment records. If the client has attended treatment, then there may be rehabilitation facility records, academic records, the types of documents that will paint a picture for the prosecutor and potentially the judge about who the client is as a person.
Okay. And these are things that, just stop me because I don't do criminal law, but they may or may not be admissible later. You're just building your file to do the best job for your client.
Well, I think the goal is twofold in gathering those mitigation documents. One, it helps me understand who my client is. And when I understand my client and I know them as a person, then I can negotiate more effectively with the prosecutor, and I can present a stronger argument on their behalf before the judge.
Okay, good advice. Thank you, Stevie. Clearly, using a private investigator to retrieve documents can be invaluable. The next area that you mentioned was having a private investigator revisit the scene.
Yes. So I will often ask my PI to revisit and examine the scene, which may include gathering and examining physical evidence, taking photographs, possibly videoing the scene. And sometimes, depending on the nature of the case, it may be helpful for the PI to conduct surveillance of the scene, especially if it's a situation where there's arguably still ongoing criminal activity.
That's interesting. I also understand one of the areas you talked about was using a private investigator to locate and potentially interview witnesses.
Yes, so PIs have access to multiple databases that allow them to find people who may not want to be found, which can be extremely helpful. I like for my PIs to interview potential witnesses and assess their credibility, to listen to their story with a view towards determining whether there may be any inconsistencies in the statements that they previously gave to law enforcement. And they may also be able to determine whether there are any witnesses who were not previously interviewed by law enforcement.
Thank you. That's also very interesting. And I would imagine that kind of bleeds into the next area that you mentioned, which was using a private investigator and what they've gained to assess a witness's credibility. Can you talk about that area that you brought up?
Sure. So we've all experienced this as attorneys. It's difficult sometimes not to have predetermined ideas about how a witness may be perceived by a jury. And a PI can be a great sounding board. If they have met with that witness, they have interviewed them, and if they're good with people, then they've probably been able to assess that witness's credibility and may be able to give you a better idea of how they may be perceived by a jury. They are very good at figuring out what it is that motivates a witness and whether there may be any inherent bias or prejudice in that particular witness's testimony.
Yeah, it seems incredibly valuable.
It is.
So what I've noticed since you've been talking to me is that a private investigator clearly has some special technology and a certain set of skills to assist you. Can you talk about those particular things that they may have access to or acquired in their experience that you utilize?
Sure. So they do have access, as I mentioned, to multiple databases. The PIs that I have worked with in the past often have access to very thorough criminal background check databases, which is another way that we assess witness credibility and determine whether a witness may be qualified to testify at all. And then I think that kind of gets into that next category of information, is that there's so much technology out there that it's difficult for a law firm to stay abreast of. So you have smartphone technology, you have polygraph technology, you have DNA, and that's only a few of the categories of information that some PIs have particular experience with.
So it seems like what you're saying, stop me if I'm just summarizing, but as a practicing attorney, you're constantly trying to properly run your business as well as effectively represent your clients. So what you're saying is that it's certainly cost effective to hire a PI who already has this technology and skill rather than trying to go learn it yourself. Would that be your recommendation to some of the attorneys watching today? Yes.
Consider whether the PI you're thinking about hiring has a skill set, a piece of equipment. I didn't mention surveillance equipment that right. you may not be paying for or have access to in your law firm. I think those are the two main things. And third, possibly a database. They may already have subscriptions that they're maintaining to databases that may be useful for your practice.
Okay, right. And thank you for that. Interesting. So choosing to use a private investigator, as you stated, can be a smart choice for the savvy lawyer. One thing we haven't talked about, which is your last area, is specifically the trial preparation and how a private investigator could potentially help you in that regard.
So depending on what the PI has done for you and your client over the life of the case and the type of evidence that he or she has acquired, they may be able to help you in trial preparation. And typically that's going to be by creating a timeline or some other type of diagram, possibly a video. And in my experience, this type of visual demonstrative evidence is very compelling before a jury.
Thank you again, Stevie. In the short time we've spoken today in this introduction to the CLE, I've learned that one of the best things that private investigator offers is that while they're gathering evidence and analyzing that, it gives you the time and the focus to work on what you do best, the legal strategies and preparing for potential trial in the case. When we come back, Stevie will be joined by private investigator Kay Baker.
We are very fortunate today to be joined by Kay Baker of Phoenix Investigative Services. Kay, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Kay, can you tell us a little bit about your professional background?
Sure. I graduated law school in the early 90s in Atlanta, which is where I'm from originally, and I practiced law for about 4 years. I was with the Attorney General's office in Atlanta doing civil defense of state law enforcement officers. In 95, I went into the FBI Academy, which is in Quantico, Virginia, to become a special agent. So I joined the Bureau in 1995. My office station was out in San Diego, California. So I moved out to California in 96. For 8 years, worked on a variety of things. I started off in the reactive squad doing investigations on bank robbery, kidnapping, extortion. We covered assault on federal officers. I also became, after a point, the Crimes Against Children coordinator, which covered child pornography investigations and interstate travel with the intent to have sex with minors. Was also eventually the lead agent for all crimes aboard aircraft. After about 5 years of doing the reactive squad work, I moved over to the public corruption unit, and I was assigned to border corruption, so handled mainly border corruption cases, drugs and illegal immigrants coming across at the border. As you know, San Diego is right on the Mexican border, so we had a good bit of business there. And then when 9/11 happened, I was transferred over to the terrorism unit and worked my last 2 years on surveillance squads with about 10 other agents were on my squad. And we did basic surveillance work for case agents who were covering terrorism matters, both domestic and international. And I left the Bureau in 2003, moved back to Atlanta, and practiced law again until 2009. I was with the Attorney General's office again, and then I was also Deputy Executive Secretary for the State Ethics Commission, which regulates campaign finance and personal financial disclosure statements for all elected public officials in the state of Georgia. In 2009, I got a job at the DA's office in Northwest Georgia and moved to Chattanooga. So I was living in Chattanooga and commuting for 6 years, prosecuting felonies and misdemeanors in a 4-county district in Northwest Georgia. In 2015 is when I decided 24 years with the government was just about enough. So I hung a shingle, got my PI license, got my company license with the Tennessee Commission for Private Investigators, and opened shop August 2015. And I've been doing it ever since. And yeah, it's been great. It was a really good professional decision to do that at that point in my career.
Kay, I think it goes without saying that you have one of the strongest backgrounds of any PI here locally in the Chattanooga-Hamilton County area. I feel very fortunate to have encountered you early on in my practice. You don't meet a lot of PIs who have both law enforcement experience and criminal justice experience as an actual attorney, so that's huge. One of the things that I talked about with Chad in the earlier portion is how important it is to make sure that any PI that we retain understands what our client is actually charged with, right, and the criminal statutes that are going to be controlling in the case. So it's very nice to know that you already have familiarity with those legal issues.
Yeah.
So you're a PI now, and you work for yourself. So can you tell us with any more specificity what it is you do currently as a PI?
Sure. Well, I'd say 95% of my clients are attorneys. 5% would be an individual who might have a personal matter that they just need help on. Of the 90% of the cases where I work directly with an attorney, I'd say 75% of those are criminal, maybe 80%. And then the rest are civil matters. So obviously I'm working with criminal defense attorneys on the criminal side. On the civil side, I've worked with both. I've worked with the plaintiff's lawyers. I've also worked with defense attorneys on civil cases. So I get just about everything. And it can run from you're a defense attorney and you need an investigator and you just hand me the discovery and you say, "Okay, go through it and let's get together in 2 weeks and then we'll talk about what I need from you." And I'll have come up with some of my to-do lists and have probably already done some research on some of the witnesses or whatever. I also have cases where an attorney just needs 1 or 2 things done. I've actually had some civil attorneys who actually need their own client located. They've lost touch. You know how these cases can take years sometimes to get through the system. And in fact, I just got hired on another matter, which is just like that. They've lost touch with the client, and they've given me permission to find the client and provide the client with a letter to say, "Please call us. We're working on your case. We have depositions scheduled, or we've got some discovery or interrogatories we have to go through with you. Please contact us." And one of the first ones I ever did, the lawyer had been calling and emailing and writing letters and no answer. And I just found the person, showed up, knocked on his door, had a nice polite conversation with him, gave him the letter, and the lawyer called me the next day and said, "Client called like an hour after you left." So I think the personal show up sometimes is all it takes. So I can do something that small, as far as how much work I might do on a particular case.
When you do work for criminal defense attorneys, do you do work for attorneys who are handling cases in state and federal court?
Yes. Yes. I'm on the CJA panel, which is the federal court panel for experts. And I've also, the state system, the administrative office of the courts, you don't have to be on a particular panel necessarily. They don't approve you or not. If the judge approves you as an investigator for that particular case, then that's all they need. I mean, you have to be a licensed investigator, but that's all that they need. But yes, I'm on both panels. I also obviously take private pay defense work with the attorney as my client, paying the bills. I submit the invoices to them.
Right, as opposed to the state or the federal government paying you to represent an indigent client.
Correct, yes.
Kay, thank you for that detailed response. What type of specific services does Phoenix Investigative Services offer?
Well, in addition to the general reviewing of discovery, once I review the discovery, I'm going to have to track down probably some of the witnesses. I'm going to have to take witness statements from certain witnesses. I'll do background on and research, which could include social media, but also database research on witnesses to maybe find them, first of all, but also to figure out, do they have any bias? And what's motivating them to testify in the way that they might testify. I do some surveillance, not a ton of surveillance, because typically one person surveillance doesn't work that well. There's just so many challenges to it that we don't need to go into now. But I will at times do some surveillance on individuals. Some of the other things I might do is, I think you mentioned in your previous segment, scene evaluation. And so I'll go out, if it's a criminal case and client was arrested at a certain place, I'll go out and maybe talk to some of the neighbors that maybe didn't make the witness list from the police discovery. Because sometimes you wonder, why didn't they? And maybe they didn't because what they had to say wasn't helpful for the government, but it could be helpful for the defense. Another instance, we had a client that was arrested in a neighborhood, and the police then later found a backpack which had some incriminating evidence, and they were identifying it with our client. So I went out and I measured the distance from, where the client was arrested to where the backpack was found, so that the attorney could argue if he felt it would be helpful. Well, the bag was, 200 feet away. It wasn't anywhere close to where my client was or whatever. And that's one of the things that I think I'm helpful at is I do the legwork on the facts and what's out there and what's available, and I give it to the attorney, and it's up to the attorney to decide, is this helpful? Do I do anything with it? I mean, I may interview 10, 15 people, but they don't need all those people, but they're able to say, they can decide who they do need. So scene evaluation. I also will take pictures, video if it's needed, but usually pictures are helpful. And I always tell people pictures are definitely worth 1,000 words. And if the lawyer can't make it to the scene for whatever reason, at least they can have a visual, through Google Maps, and then the pictures that I've taken that are like right on the scene of just the location of the arrest or what a witness might look like. So that's another thing that I do. Just a few other things that come to mind are gathering documents. I think you mentioned, the attorney doesn't always have time to run around and gather medical records or work records, or even criminal records. If the client has a criminal history in other counties, and those you need certified copies of convictions, or if a witness has convictions in other counties or even in Hamilton County, then I'll get those documents for the attorney, and the attorney can then say, okay, follow up a little bit more, maybe get us certified if we need it. And then I also, depending on the attorney, I'm very helpful in client relations. The attorney doesn't have all the time in the world to see a client, as often as the client might like. And so there would be times where I could go visit the client, especially the ones that are in custody, and go over some things with the client for the attorney. I do not give legal advice to any of our clients. I leave that up to the lawyer, even though I do know the law and I know generally what's admissible and what's not, but that's not my job. And I just kind of help with the client relations in that aspect.
Kay, one of the things Chad and I talked about earlier on in the segment is how beneficial a PI can be in assessing witness credibility. And certainly a PI who is as personable as I know you to be. Can you talk a little bit about what you bring to the table in that regard?
Sure. The lawyer doesn't have time to go out and meet or even have the witness come in their office and meet them. So when I'm out taking statements or doing research on the witnesses, I'm able to talk to them face to face as opposed to on the phone. Some interviews, sure, you can do on the phone, but some witnesses, you really just need to get eyes on them. So I think generally what I provide in the way of witness credibility is eyes on the person so that the attorney who's going to be questioning that witness has a better understanding of how they might come across to a jury.
So, Kay, in my experience, one of the benefits of hiring a PI is as simple as just making more time, right? So as the attorney, I'm focused on courtroom strategies, I'm focused on procedure, a lot of research and writing. I can't go out and follow a witness around all day, but you may be able to. Can you give me an example of a time when you've done something like that for a lawyer?
Sure. I mean, several times, I will, and I dress casually. Sometimes I'm wearing shorts and tennis shoes and, a visor. And so I can blend in a little bit better than a lawyer wearing a nice suit or, I don't look like the law. My husband is he's bald. He's like, I could never do what you do. No one would ever open the door because, he looks like a cop. And I don't look like a cop. And so I'm able to go places where, I'm not as suspicious, I guess. Certainly I can't sit in any one place for 6 hours. I have had the police called on me once. So, but yeah, there was an instance, there was a woman claiming she was injured and the lawyers didn't believe that she was as injured as she claimed, or that they thought she might be malingering somewhat. And so I followed her. I sat outside her place of business. I followed her on her way home. She happened to stop at a small grocery store, And lo and behold, she gets out of her car and she's not wearing the boot that she had been wearing at work. So I followed her around the store with my iPhone, just holding it just like this. And I just had it trained on her and acted like I was just shopping. And I got about 5 minutes of her. And it was helpful to the attorney. So there are instances like that. I have 5 dogs, and I've used 2 different dogs in certain instances where I had to serve subpoenas. In criminal cases, there are instances where I've been hired, either I was already on the case or it's just to serve subpoenas, but the people have proven cagey, and the marshals couldn't serve them or the sheriff's office couldn't serve them. Not sure how hard they tried, but so I got hired to serve subpoenas. So I'm walking through the neighborhood with one of my dogs, and I walk right up to the front door, and nobody says anything. And one time we had lost one of our dogs, and so I had flyers for lost dog, please contact. So I had the subpoenas, and I had folded them inside the flyer for the lost dog. So if anybody happened, because they look at your hands. And if they see some official-looking document, they're going to get all weird on you. So they look down, they see a dog picture, and they answer the door, they open the door, and I'm like, are you Mr. Smith or Mrs. Smith or whatever? And they're like, yeah. It's like, well, I've got some paperwork for you from the clerk's office. And, I'm able to serve people. And one of the lawyers, I've done a lot of stuff like this for him where he can't get people to call him. It's a witness or it's a defendant or whatever, or a client sometimes. And he uses me exclusively for this because, I'll show up and I'll, I'm not, a mean, scary person, and they don't feel intimidated talking to me, and I can maybe get a statement from them, but I can get them served as well. And I've actually had people when I don't do this anymore, but I was working for a landlord-tenant attorney, and I had to serve a lot of papers for people who needed to pay their rent. And I've hated doing it because I was always expecting someone to throw something at me or yell at me. Never. And in fact, most of them thanked me for being so nice, right? Because I'd say, I've got some paperwork, here's the number, you need to show up on this day, So, a lot of it, it's not how smart the investigator is, it's how well do they actually do their job, and how can they better help you create witness relations. Witnesses are intimidated by lawyers a lot of times, so if they've talked to the investigator and they liked the investigator, maybe they're less stressed out about the whole process. So anyway, so those are some fun things I get to do, and it's fun. So,
good.
Yeah.
Good. Kay, I get calls a lot from criminal defense attorneys who are either just starting out, or they're new to the Chattanooga area, or they've just never hired a PI before, and they want to know how to get started. I think it's really important that these attorneys understand a little bit more about your profession before they pull the trigger and hire a PI. Is the field of private investigations a regulated profession?
It is. It is regulated by the Tennessee Department of Commerce and Insurance. And within that department, there is a commission on private investigators and polygraphers. Not sure why they lumped us together, but they have. And so they have, there's a law on the Tennessee books that kind of regulates us generally, like all licensed professionals. But then there are specific rules and regulations set forth by the Tennessee Commission of PIs and polygraphers that dictate, how you get a license, how you start a company, a PI company, the tests you have to take, the rules you have to follow, and that kind of thing. So yeah, we are regulated. So the Tennessee Commission issues a license to a private investigator, assuming they've met all those requirements initially, and you renew it every 2 years. And as part of the renewal, you have to show that you've had 12 hours of a continuing education. You have to answer questions that you've not been convicted of a felony in those 2 years, you've not had any financial issues in those 2 years. So similar to renewing your license as an attorney. So that's every 2 years.
Kay, we're a tri-state city, and I can't tell you how often I have issues come up where I've got a PI who I need to do work in Tennessee, but I'm also going to have to interview witnesses, for example, in Georgia. Does a PI have to be licensed in every state that they practice in any capacity?
No, but there are restrictions. If I just have a Tennessee license, right? I don't have a Georgia license to be a private investigator in Georgia or any other state for that matter. But there are certain states that Tennessee has what we call a reciprocity agreement with. So, and Georgia is one of those. If the case originates in Tennessee, where I am licensed, and there are witnesses or things that need to be done in Georgia, I am allowed to go into Georgia and do those things, whether it's gather documents, interview witnesses, track down people, as long as it doesn't exceed, I think it's a lot. It's like 15 days of work in Georgia. But vice versa, if your case is in Georgia, but you have witnesses in Tennessee that need to be interviewed or documents that need to be gathered or whatever it's in Tennessee, then I can do the Tennessee part. So, as an attorney, if it's a Georgia case and you need a lot of investigating, you probably wouldn't want to hire me for the Tennessee part because that just makes it a little disjointed. But if all you need are some witnesses interviewed and they're in Tennessee, then you can hire me to do that. But I cannot work in Georgia on a Georgia case.
Okay. All right. So attorneys need to have some idea of where that work is going to need to be performed before they choose their private investigator.
Yes, definitely.
And how does an attorney go about confirming that a PI is licensed in the necessary state before hiring that person?
I'm not sure how it works in other states. I assume their Secretary of State's office does what Tennessee does, which it lists all the PIs who have an active license. It also lists ones that are inactive or suspended or whatever. So you can look them up, and you can look them up by name and by company, because my company is Phoenix Investigative Services, and I'm the only investigator and the only employee. But if I worked for Ajax Investigations, but there's 10 investigators, just looking up Ajax is probably not going to give you a whole lot about me. You could look up in the Tennessee system under my name, my individual name.
So we will be able to go on and tell whether that PI is currently licensed and also whether they have any disciplinary history.
Yes.
Okay, great. Are there also ethical rules that govern your profession?
Yes, just like attorneys, although we don't have nearly as many as the attorneys do. But yes, they're in the rules and regulations on, what you can and can't do. You can't misrepresent what you're doing or who you are, things like that. General ethics. There's not a lot, I'll be honest with you. But it's basically, don't steal clients' money, all the basics. And that's generally it. If you get a felony conviction, that's not allowed. I think if you have to report misdemeanors as well, but I don't think they would necessarily suspend you or permanently take your license for a misdemeanor. But yeah, we have to report certain things like that.
Okay. And are those ethical rules readily available online so that attorneys can familiarize themselves with those rules and make sure they're not asking you to do anything that's considered unethical?
Sure. And it's the website, Secretary of State, then you drop down to the Commerce and Insurance, then you drop down further to the Commission on PIs and polygraphers, and then the rules are listed there along with the state law that basically regulates the investigator. And then as far as like what a PI can and can't do, like I said, there's not a can do, can't do list, but what I always tell a lawyer is if you can't do it, then I can't, nor will I. Like wiretapping, you can't do it, so I'm not doing it. Sure. Trespassing on private property, I can't do that. I can't hide in a tree on property that says no trespassing. If I'm looking for somebody or if I'm interviewing a witness, sometimes there's a no trespassing sign, but I'll at least try and knock on the door. If they ask me to leave, I leave. So yeah, I can't do anything that you wouldn't be able to do or anything that is against the law.
And you don't have the same powers, and this may seem silly, but as a law enforcement officer, even though you have a background in law enforcement, you can't detain someone, you can't arrest someone, you can't issue a subpoena like a court would do, nothing like that.
Correct. Yes, I am a private investigator. I'm not a public investigator.
Okay, you're not a member of law enforcement, and you're not an attorney, so important to keep those parameters in mind.
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
great.
absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, beyond the basic requirement of licensure, are there certain credentials, experience, or qualifications that, in your opinion, make a PI better suited for one case than perhaps another PI?
Well, sure. Yes. It obviously depends on the case, but it also depends on what you need them for. So if you need somebody to analyze, phone data, or, somebody who knows about how phone records and phone data is generated, you're not going to want me, because I don't know that. But there are investigators out there that were prior law enforcement who that was what they did. They were the social media and the phone records gurus for that department. So it does depend on what the case is about, but it also depends on why you would need an investigator to begin with. I think if you wanted your client to take a polygraph, you obviously want to hire an investigator, and these people are out there too, who were prior polygraphers for law enforcement agencies. If you are just looking for an investigator to help you with your case, kind of in the way that we've been talking, I think it's important that you find an investigator that's got some experience in the criminal justice field, either as an attorney, maybe they did defense work prior to becoming, or prosecution like I did, before they became a private investigator. You might want to find somebody who's been in law enforcement before, but it's not necessarily required in all cases. But to me, if I was the attorney hiring the investigator, I'd want somebody who knows almost as much as I do about the criminal justice system, because I think you can have investigators that might go down a rabbit hole on something that they think is relevant, but somebody who has either a prior law degree or prior experience in law enforcement, they're going to understand that is really never going to be admissible, and it's not going to be helpful. Because as you know, and I do this, I find things that aren't necessarily going to be admissible, but they are going to help the attorney frame their defense strategy and ask certain questions in a certain way to get the information that is admissible out of a witness. So, it might be hearsay from the person I'm interviewing, but you, the lawyer, might be able to get that same information out of the investigator because they asked the witness that same question, and the investigator can talk about it. There's ways around it. So I think prior history or experience in any kind of a law enforcement background, but even then, you want to make sure that they had a good experience or they had a good reputation. You don't want to hire some rogue cop who got fired from their job for mishandling evidence or something like that. So you want to know who you're hiring. Even if their resume on paper looks great, you might want to ask around, maybe see if they've been used by any other attorneys in town and what that experience was.
I think you briefly touched on testifying at trial. Is it possible that as a PI, you may need to testify on behalf of the attorney you're working for and his or her client?
Absolutely. I've been doing this for just over 4 years. I've only had the opportunity twice, so it doesn't happen often. One was in a federal case. It was a Franks hearing, a motion to dismiss, or motion to suppress, and the attorney had me go out to the scene and take pictures and assess the video and the search warrant and how it was. He handled the particulars of the search warrant on the paper and argued the legal argument there, but he had me testify to some of the problem areas that we saw in the execution of that search warrant. So that was one instance. Another instance, it was a bond hearing, I think, and I had, done some background work for the attorney on the client's behalf. So experience in testifying. If you're a former law enforcement officer, you probably had that experience because that's what you would do. Prior attorneys, attorneys don't typically testify. But one of the other, and this just came to me, when I interview a witness, if they told the police the light was red, car accident, for instance, your client is charged with vehicular homicide or something. So the witness tells law enforcement at the scene the light was red, your client ran the red light. But I go out, 9, 10, 11 months later, and they say the light was green. They tell me it, and I've recorded it, or I've made my notes, and, that they said it was green. Witness gets called to trial, and they now go back to the light was red. Well, you can say, well, witness, do you remember on June 11th, last year, you were interviewed by my investigator and you said the light was green. If they fight you on it and refuse to agree, then you can later put me on the stand and tell the jury, well, here's my notes or here's my recording, and they told me the light was green. And you can use that to your advantage to maybe show that the witness is not credible. If you had interviewed the witness, you can't get on the stand. And has that ever happened? No. But it's something to think about. So it's very helpful to have a third person do the interview, not the attorney.
Sure, and it may never have happened in that particular factual situation, but certainly it does come up, and that can be the difference in reasonable doubt.
Right, exactly.
Kay, you have a very diverse background. How do you believe your prior professional experiences have informed your work as a PI?
Well, there's the obvious law enforcement experience with the FBI. I was a criminal justice major in college, so that was kind of where the interest started. I think I've said this before. Or maybe I didn't. You're either a good investigator or you're not, and a lot of that is just who you are as a person. Can you think on your feet? Can you, talk to anybody? But then the law enforcement experience does give you some tools in your little tool belt on, what has worked before, just gives you ideas on how to do surveillance, for instance. I did almost 2 full years of surveillance when I was with the FBI. And I think I mentioned at the time I had like 10 other agents on the team. So, we could mark north, south, east, west, and the same person wasn't following the target all day long, which is why it's hard for me or any one person to do surveillance. It's easy to get lost at a traffic light or burned because they see you in 4 different places. And, so it's challenging, but at least the experience of having the surveillance, I think it adds a little bit of information for me to use in my current job. I think my legal background is helpful. I think we've already talked about how I have an understanding of admissibility versus inadmissibility. I understand, and I'm very focused on not doing anything that's illegal or that could be perceived as illegal, because I don't want to be in trouble. I also don't want the lawyer, to be guilty by association because they hired me on or got me appointed. And my license is important to me, both my law licenses, which I'm licensed in Georgia and Tennessee. Even though I'm not practicing, I want to keep those in good standing. And then my investigator license. I'm still young. I want to do this for a long time. So I think having the legal background gave me the tools to know, what's important and keeps me from going down this rabbit hole that, somebody without that legal training and or legal experience as a practicing attorney has. Having been a prosecutor for 6 years, what I tend to do is the defense attorney might say, okay, this is kind of my defense strategy, and we would be talking about a witness, and I'd say, well, if I was the prosecutor, this is what I'm doing. And I'm trying to help you understand, you're the defense attorney, where you might want to fine-tune your argument or your questions to help you with your whole defense strategy. And I know a lot of defense attorneys used to be prosecutors too, so they have that already, but I think 2 heads are better than 1 in that aspect. So I think my experience as a prosecutor is helpful for that. My other experience in the Attorney General's office, I did civil defense of state law enforcement. So I represented the State Patrol, for instance. So, my clients were cops, and then I became a law enforcement officer myself. So I've been around the criminal justice system since college. And I think all of that, you mentioned diverse. It's like, when I look back, it's like, my God. I mean, it is kind of interesting how I've landed in the different jobs that I've landed in. And I think all of them created a perfect storm for me to be an investigator and be a good one. And it's something that I really, really enjoy. So,
well, I couldn't agree more. And especially your legal background, I appreciate knowing that you understand my professional responsibilities to my client, and I don't have to explain that to you.
Right.
That you also understand how important deadlines are in state and federal court, and that you already have an idea for how quickly these cases have to move. So we don't have to repeatedly have that conversation, which I think is an issue a lot of attorneys run into with PIs.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and I'm big on deadlines. And if I haven't heard from a client, an attorney, in a while, I'm sending an email saying, hey, when we last spoke 2 weeks ago, you said X, do we need to follow up? Or, because I don't want the lawyer to panic, because I know y'all have a lot on your plate and think, oh my God, I need this tomorrow. Well, I've got a lot of other clients I have to answer to, so I may not be available for you. So I try to keep the train moving, to the extent that I can, because I get it. As an attorney, you got a lot on your plate, and because I was one, and it's stressful. So I just enjoy being behind the scenes as opposed to out front. I got tired of arguing every day with people as a lawyer, so I decided I would step back and not do that anymore.
Well, we appreciate your help.
Sure.
Kay, in private cases, it's really important that we as attorneys find a PI who our client can afford. How do you structure your fees?
Well, it depends on the case, but I have a standard rate, which is $100 an hour, plus mileage, plus any database costs that I incur, and I pass those on to you. Nights and weekends, it goes up. If I'm just serving a summons, if it's close by, like it's downtown or in the really close surroundings of my office, I'll charge, $100 for 3 attempts. But if I have to travel at any distance, even if it's just to serve a subpoena, I'm going to charge you an hourly rate plus the mileage. So it really depends. But basically, my rates are $100 an hour if it's a private client.
And do you accept retainers up front and then bill at those retainers, or do you just start off billing at an hourly rate?
It depends on who I'm working with. Some attorneys prefer to get the retainer from their client up front, and the attorney hangs on to that retainer, and I then bill off of that. Some attorneys prefer that the retainer come to me, and I have a separate account like lawyers do where I put that retainer money, and once I've done the work on it, I'll invoice it. The client gets a copy of that invoice and whatever money is left over after I've moved it over to my operations. But I would say most of my cases are where I do the work and then just bill the attorney, and the attorney either has it in their bank account from the client, or they get it from the client at that point.
And you're referring to the attorney's IOLTA account.
Correct, yes. Yeah, and that's what I call it too. It's just hard to say, so I don't
So do you think that your $100 an hour rate with those contingencies is pretty standard for the Chattanooga-Hamilton County area?
I'm not sure, because first of all, there aren't a lot of investigators in this area. And we don't, I have this question all the time. It's like, can you refer somebody else? You have a conflict. I need somebody else. I'm like, it's not like we have a club, and we don't see each other like y'all do. You're in court every day or, a couple days a week, and you see each other. Well, we don't operate. We're like behind the scenes. So, I don't know what everybody else charges. When I first started, I heard that might be a little more than what other investigators charge, but I think I'm worth it. So
I think you're worth it too.
I don't know if I want to keep that.
Well, I think that leads kind of nicely into the next subject that I wanted to touch on. I couldn't agree more. There aren't enough PIs in the Chattanooga, Hamilton County area. And sometimes I get calls from attorneys who have used PIs lots throughout their practice, but their PI that they normally use is conflicted because maybe they have a big large-scale conspiracy in federal court and all the PIs have been taken up by the other lawyers. And it can be really hard to find somebody, let alone to find a handful of people who you can then vet and choose the one that's best suited for your case. So what is the best way for us to go about finding PIs?
Start using them, and you and I, we met years ago, and then we went through a period of time where you didn't need my services because you were doing some other things. And then you came back and you used me again because you knew me from before. So, I think just using a PI, and I've had lawyers who had bad experiences with PIs and they swore they were never using another PI again. It wasn't worth the effort. The PI did a crappy job or whatever. And then I come on the scene and the lawyer happened to know me from practicing in Catoosa and Walker County. And, he tried me and he told me recently, he goes, I don't use anybody but you. And if I can't have you, I'll just do it myself or I'll have a paralegal gather the documents or whatever. But so I think you just have to use them and, see which ones work best for you. Because if you don't use them at all and you don't know which ones you like or which ones do what you want them to do and you don't gel with, you might find yourself scrambling when you need one because you don't know any, because you haven't used them. Right. And you'll find yourself in that situation in federal court where, the drug conspiracy has 10 defendants. And I've had lawyers, the minute they get the call from the clerk's office, they'll call me and they say, this is the case number, these are the co-defendants, have you been retained yet? Because if you haven't, I'm going to fill out the paperwork and I'm going to file with CJA panel and get you on the case. So I think you just have to use them in order to know who you like and who you don't like. So they're in your back pocket.
Now, if you go to the website that you mentioned earlier that lists the private investigators and whether they're licensed, does that also indicate the localities where those PIs work?
Good question. I don't know.
I don't know either. Fortunately, I have you and one or two other PIs who I've worked with in the past, so it hasn't come up. But I know you've got a great website. It's pretty basic, but it tells.
Okay. I was about to say, have you seen it?
Well, it's basic, but it tells an attorney exactly what they need to know. And frankly, like you said, you got to pick up the phone and call. You've got to meet with the PI in person. You've got to determine whether you kind of gel with that person. But do most PIs in your experience have even just a single page? So if you're Googling, you can kind of get a short list?
Honestly, I'm not sure. I know some do, but, the ones that have the flashy websites with the links and, all the graphics. I'm like, you're spending your time on a website? Are you really being an investigator? I don't know.
You have to question why they need all the bells and whistles.
Right, yeah. And I don't advertise. This is helpful, but, I've never advertised. When I started, I sent letters. I identified probably 25 attorneys in town. And I'm not from here, so I moved here in 2009. So I met a few attorneys just through social activities, and I asked them, I need a list, and I'm going to send out a letter with my bio right before I open my doors. And that was how I identified, and got business. And then ever since then, it's just been word of mouth. I don't have any ads. My website, like you said, there's no bells and whistles. It's one page. It's just got my info on it, my background, and the types of stuff that I do. And a nice picture from Lake Placid when I went up there 2 years ago. But it's just basic. But yeah, I think my reputation and an investigator's reputation is more important than their, fancy website. And you won't know that until you meet with the person and they work with you.
So I guess the takeaway would be If you want to have a short list of PIs that you can go to when you need them, then start using them and kind of build that database within your firm. And if it's your first time hiring a PI, call an experienced criminal defense attorney in your area who you know has hired private investigators in the past.
Right. And I know y'all have, associations like the defense attorneys associations and things like that. I mean, I heard someone told me that's where they got my name. They posted on a web page or a browser page or whatever and said, hey, who's used an investigator in Hamilton County and who was it? And so that's another resource, is just joining those associations.
Sure, our professional organizations.
Sure. Yeah.
Great. Well, Kay, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
We've enjoyed having you. I think this has been highly informative, and perhaps we'll pick up another day with a different topic involving PIs.
That'd be great. I'd enjoy it. Thank you.